Hello, this is Daniel and welcome to the fourth part of this character modeling tutorial series. Today we will be talking about starting the character creation process. We will actually do some practical work in ZBrush. We will talk about simplification, shape language and balance. And we will be finishing the blocking stage of this character creation process. So, without wasting too much more time, let us get started. So our first topic for today is getting started with the character creation process. The first question that we typically have to ask ourselves in this sort of task is, where do I start? Now in the first part we collected references already, which was a very important first step. In the second and third part we looked at how to use the software that we need for our project, but now how do I actually begin the sculpt? The quick answer to that is something called blocking. Blocking is sort of the drafting stage of your sculpt, where you only use primitive shapes to lay out your form, and it's really about defining the shapes, the silhouette, and the proportions of your design. This stage it's one of the most important stages actually, and I want to talk a bit more about why that is. I want to make an argument that relates to proportions and silhouettes. First of all, we need to look at perception. We recognize objects in our world through the basic shape, is sort of the assumption here. Basically, that refers to the proportions, the silhouette, sort of the basic shapes that you kind of see within such objects. And that is since basically, if we look at the world, there is always a lot of noise around us. It could be that we're far away maybe from the object that we see. It could be the light conditions. Every object is slightly different after all, or many other things, smoke and so on. So we don't always see all the details in the first place. And I can give you actually an example. If you look at these two characters very quickly, they are very different in their details. They have different hairstyles, different cloths, but if you would look at their silhouette, you couldn't really tell their difference. They're pretty similar in the end. And so if you had, all your characters without, too much difference in their silhouette and proportions, or if you didn't define them properly, you would end up, your image would end up changing quite a lot. And now to give the opposite example, here are two characters who have very similar details. So I gave them the same kind of shirt, but in the end they are completely different for the simple reason that their basic form, their basic silhouette, the thing that we recognize the first, is completely different. And that's why we really need to focus on this stage very much. So what that means for us is that basically in any sort of creation process of art, we should first spend a lot of time on the drafting stage, because if the foundation is weak, if the foundation is boring, and if it doesn't convey the sort of story that you want to tell, the finished art will be weak as well. Therefore, let us start by using very few primitive shapes to define the silhouette as accurately as possible. Now that we have all the theory out of the way, let us actually get started. Now it's time for us to open ZBrush or Blender, depending on what you like, what you prefer to use, and I'll show you how I go about sculpting. So here we are now in ZBrush. I initially wanted to record myself while talking, however it turned out to be very difficult and quite a challenge to do that, so instead I decided to, at least for now, do a voiceover for this part. You can see me work here in ZBrush at the moment, and I have begun to create this block out. All I'm doing is simply creating some new volumes. The approach that I take is to either copy the current selection by holding Control and by using the transformation gizmos to basically create a copy of that part. Or you can also use the IMM insert brush, the IMM primitives insert brush, to add a new sphere wherever you need it. One more advice that I can give you is related to Dynamesh. You will definitely run into this issue that sometimes you have too much geometry in one spot, and it's very difficult to really, smoothen out the shapes. It is very important in this stage that you reduce your geometry as much as possible. And that will require you sometimes to recalculate the density, the geometry, the mesh. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to go to polygroups, that panel, to press auto groups to sort of assign one polygroup to each loose part, and then to use Dynamesh, but make sure that you activate that little groups button that should be available next to the Dynamesh tool. Finally, I want to give one last advice related to why we use reference. So using reference is always a bit of a controversial topic, but I want to give you a good reason for why it is important to use references when sculpting. Now, sculpting is quite a complex process in my opinion. You're looking at your model from various angles, and because of that, it can be very difficult to properly estimate and assess the proportions and the silhouette. It can be very distracting, in other words. However, if you draw, it is a lot easier to focus on such aspects. Now, for this reason, it would make sense to separate those two tasks, to focus on your proportions and the silhouette while working in 2D, and when you work in 3D, to use your reference as a guide, but only to focus on the three-dimensional shape instead. Now let's take a quick break from sculpting so that we can look at a few more topics in theory. So then it's time for us to talk about simplification, shape language, and balance. In summary, these are techniques that will help you strengthen and solidify the expression of your design, which means that it helps you emphasize the story that you're trying to tell with your artwork. To begin with the first topic, which is simplification, I want to make the following assumption, that visual art is also communication. It's the situation where we always have some sort of goal with our art. Take a movie, for example. If you have a bad character show up, you want the audience to understand that this character is bad and we should feel negative about this one person. And so that's why, as I wrote it here on the presentation, in our case we want to convey our narrative and the audience should feel what the creator wants them to feel. To understand all this a little bit better, let's take a look at a very common model of communication. You can see that in this model, the sender is on the left side and the receiver is on the right side, and they're sending a message through a channel of communication. The responsibilities of the sender are to encode the message, and the receiver needs to decode and interpret what has been told. And you can tell from this model that there is not much we can do to help the receiver understand. All we can do is do our best to encode the message in a way that is as clear as possible. So if we want the receiver to understand us, understand our message as good as possible without any mistake, we need to make sure that our encoding is as clear as it can be. That's why we need to simplify. It's the same in art, basically. The more details you add, the more sort of noise you add, the more difficult it will be for your audience to understand what you're trying to tell them. So let's take a look at a quick example. I made 2 sketches of cars, and I just want to demonstrate to you that a very simple shape can be everything you need to convey your thought. With my upper sketch, I wanted to sort of convey that this is a sports car, that we're talking about a sports car, and I think it gets across completely. Now with the lower sketch, I focused more on the details. I just added all those lines that a car would have, the door handle, the seats, the people inside. But if you think about it, all of these things don't matter to our message. So that's why it's very important to simplify and to focus on those basic shapes. Now let's take a look at the second topic, which is shape language. Shapes are basically the building blocks of our visual language, just like letters are in our language. and each shape conveys a different message. There are round shapes, there are edgy ones, or ones with lots of corners. There's other adjectives too: stable, unstable, thick, thin, light, heavy, regular, irregular. Proportions are also one big topic that comes up in this regard. And if you look at all these, I think that we're able to attribute various sort of emotions to them. One very typical interpretation of these shapes is that round shapes are more friendly, square shapes are very stable, corners might seem aggressive. You can see that an inverted triangle that's standing on its tip seems very unstable. So in such a way, these shapes are very powerful in a way, and by using these shapes in a character design, you can convey your message a lot better. Now, in our blocking stage, the reason why I mentioned it is that we still have the ability to make changes and to focus on such shapes. So we should realize that such shapes exist in our character design, and we should try to use them intentionally. Now let's move on to the third and last topic, which is balance, and it's one of my favorite topics. Basically, balance is very close and related to dynamics. The line of action is something I hope you have heard about before. You can quickly look it up on Google to find out more about it, but it basically is the simplified line of motion that goes through a character, and it's used very often in animation, and it helps the animators to emphasize the direction of the motion. However, such arcs and curves can also be used in static designs, and it brings lots of benefits, such as giving a sense of weight and balance. It can make the whole character more visually appealing and dynamic, and it can also be used to guide the viewer's eye through the design. Therefore, we should think about such lines to achieve better results, and that's regardless of the art style. I want to give you an example, of course, and I'll take our character design, and I want to show you all the lines that actually exist in this design that we don't realize if we just look at this character. The first line I'll show you is here in a leg from the side view. There is a very, very nice S-curve that you wouldn't necessarily be drawing if you just tried to draw a leg. But I knew that I wanted this leg to be dynamic, and I wanted to emphasize that this leg is holding the weight of the body. Not to say that the weight would be heavy, but there is a weight, and we are demonstrating the gravity through this sort of indication. And there are also other lines. You can see that the spine is a similar situation. Again, just like a spring, it carries weight. And if we add a few more shapes to indicate the feet stabilizing the weight, and then also the head for such a mass that is being carried, you can see that these lines alone very, very nicely balance the character, and that's something very important. From the front view, we have also some very interesting lines. You can see that this one, for example, stretches through the entire body. It's also very curved. It's just like a spring, really, and it emphasizes this continuity. It helps the viewer. It helps to guide the viewer's eye, and it also indicates, as I mentioned, the dynamics that are visible in this character. We can also add a few more lines to indicate the weight at the top. And I found a couple of more lines that kind of, it's hard for me to classify all of these, but they're very interesting if you really look at them. You can see that many lines, especially in the legs, are connected, and they sort of create this flow through the body that's very nice and dynamic. So I think these are some of the things you want to look out for. And you can even go further and analyze the axis through which such lines are connected. And you can see that in the leg in particular, there is a rhythm of lines being sort of slightly slanted into different directions. And this really emphasizes this spring, and it's the reason for why this leg looks so dynamic and sort of beautiful in a way, because of all these different shapes that emphasize that weight is being carried. Now, these are some things I want you to look out for, and especially in this blocking stage that we're currently in, these sort of things are those that you want to look out for. It's very difficult at first, but give it a try. I think it can be very fun after all. With that said, let us get back to ZBrush, where we are going to finish the blocking of this character. So here we are in ZBrush one more time, and you can see me start by adding a few more volumes that I have not created in a previous session. I'm beginning with the feet, which in this case are actually the shoes, and I decided to go for the shoes instead of bare feet, for the simple reason that it is a very important part to the character design, and I do not intend to really show her without the shoes anyways. I mentioned that we would only be using primitive shapes such as spheres and cylinders in this blocking stage, and it is true for the most part, but I believe that in some cases, such as the shoes in this situation, you could have reduced it to simpler shapes indeed, but it doesn't really matter. It is a very minor part of your design, and I didn't rely on it too much, so I think that in this case it was alright. You can also see me make various adjustments with the legs and also other parts such as the arms and the body. I'm doing this to sort of implement and improve on those kind of points that I mentioned previously with the slides. You want to make sure to simplify it, to keep the dynamic, and also to think about your shape language. Those things should be very solid and clear. This is really the assignment, the task that you have to accomplish in this phase, so make sure that you're comfortable with this result. I'm now also working on the head, and you can see that I am very simply indicating the shape by just using a sphere for the main volume and by adding another part indicating just a little bit the nose and the mandible bone. I also want to mention one thing that I forgot to point out. I also created some geometry for the shoulder itself, so you can see that between the arm and the chest there is sort of a bridge between those two parts, and I believe that that's one very important volume that sometimes is ignored by some artists, but I prefer to add it. One more information I have is regarding the arms. Now, it is very difficult to make arms in a pose that seems relaxed, yet is sort of a static pose. However, I do think you should do your best to keep the arms as straight as possible, especially from the front view. They will have a little bend in them, but especially from the front view, make them straight so that in the rigging stage it's much easier to work with them. Also, about the hands, I know they're a bit difficult, especially to get the size right, and the wrist itself is a very sort of a place that's hard to create, since there's not even a good reference available for that part. But play around with it and just keep going until you feel it looks alright. I think in that way you should be able to get a result that's quite close to what I'm showing you here. Finally, before we finish this block out, I want to point out that very often I go and compare what I've created to my reference in the background. I am not doing it right now, but I did it I think a few seconds ago. I'm always adjusting it and checking if the proportions really align, and you can see me even reposing the arms a couple of times to really make sure that even in a different pose those arms will not look strange. So that concludes now the block out of our character. I'm just giving her ears to finish things off. And with that said, it's time for us to go back to our slides just to conclude on this video. So thank you for watching one more time. This was the fourth part of this character modeling tutorial series. We looked at how to get started in character creation. We talked about blocking, giving an argument about the silhouette and about how we perceive the world around us. We talked about simplification, shape language, and balance. And finally, we finished our block out in ZBrush one more time. And we can now look forward to next week, where we will begin to work on a more detailed version of the sculpt. Now I hope that you enjoyed this video and that it was very useful to you. If you liked it, consider to like this video, leave your comments and subscribe. You can also support me through Patreon. I have posted a link in the description. And also consider becoming a channel member, something very new that I'm currently trying out. I will be sharing some extra content both on Patreon as well as to the YouTube channel members, so if you're interested, definitely take a look. With that said, that's everything I have for this week, and I'm looking forward to see you next time.